Which experiment proved people are easily controlled? Story 1. In 1939, University of Iowa speech pathologist Wendell Johnson supervised a graduate student named Mary Tudor in an experiment on 22 orphan children at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. The children were divided into two groups. One group received positive speech therapy. They were told they were good speakers and encouraged. The other group received negative speech therapy. Normal speaking children were told they had stuttering problems, that their speech was bad, that they should stop speaking if they weren't sure they could speak correctly. Johnson's own theory of stuttering, which he had developed partly from his experience as a person who stuttered, held that stuttering was caused by negative labeling rather than any underlying physical difference, that children were told they stuttered and then became stutterers. The experiment was designed to test this by attempting to induce stuttering in normal speaking children through negative verbal feedback. Several children in the negative feedback group developed lasting speech problems. Some showed anxiety and social withdrawal that persisted into adulthood. None of them were told the study's actual purpose. The experiment was known within the field for decades, but not publicly disclosed until a 2001 San Jose Mercury News investigation. The University of Iowa subsequently issued a formal apology in 2001. Several of the surviving participants sued and received a $925,000 settlement from the state of Iowa in 2007. Johnson called it the monster study in internal communications, apparently understanding the ethical dimensions of what was being done. The label stuck when the research became public. The experiment's results were never published. Johnson apparently chose not to publish them, which means the harm was done, and the scientific record received nothing in return. The orphans were chosen specifically because orphans could be used without parental consent. Story 2 Project Artichoke, the CIA program that preceded MKUltra, is better known for its pharmaceutical experiments, but one of its most documented and most controllable techniques required no substances at all. Extended solitary confinement combined with sleep deprivation, sensory disruption, and systematic interrogation at unpredictable intervals. The declassified documents from Artichoke describe procedures run on subjects including captured foreign agents, and in some cases, individuals whose exact legal status relative to U.S. authorities is unclear from the available records. The specific protocols involved holding subjects in small, featureless rooms with disrupted light cycles, kept artificially lit or darkened at irregular intervals to prevent the subject from maintaining any internal sense of time. Meals arrived unpredictably. Interrogation sessions occurred at hours that maximized confusion between sleeping and waking states. The goal was the same as Cameron's more intensive depatterning work: to disorient the subject's relationship to reality to a degree that the normal psychological defenses against disclosure, the capacity to maintain a consistent story, to plan, to hold information in organized memory, would degrade. A person who does not know what day it is, who cannot distinguish memory from dream, who has lost track of how long they have been confined, is a person whose cognitive architecture is being deliberately dismantled. The research literature on solitary confinement in prison contexts confirms what the Artichoke documents described. Extended isolation produces measurable, documented psychological damage, including anxiety, depression, perceptual distortion, and in severe or prolonged cases, full psychotic breaks in psychologically healthy individuals with no prior history of mental illness. The Artichoke isolation protocols were the controlled, documented version of what prisons were producing accidentally in administrative segregation units across the United States. The difference was that Artichoke knew what it was doing and was doing it intentionally. The technique required no drugs, just time and a room and someone controlling what got in. Story 3 Solomon Ash's conformity research with line judgments is foundational to understanding social pressure on stated belief, but the replications that extended his findings into expert populations produced results that were, in some ways, more disturbing than the original undergraduate studies. The basic Ash finding when 7 Confederates unanimously gave an obviously wrong answer to a simple perceptual question, approximately 37% of participants conformed to the incorrect majority answer on critical trials, stating things they could see were incorrect because the social environment had made independent dissent costly. The extension to expert populations, subsequent research, examined whether professional expertise in a domain insulated people from social conformity pressure within that domain. The answer was, partially, and less than most experts believed about themselves. Medical professionals shown diagnostic information and then exposed to incorrect peer consensus shifted their stated diagnoses toward the consensus at rates that exceeded chance. Legal professionals evaluating arguments shifted their evaluations in the direction of apparent peer consensus. The mechanism that expertise partially, but not fully, counteracts is the cognitive cost of independent evaluation. Experts have better tools for evaluating evidence independently, which somewhat reduces reliance on social cues. But the social cost of dissent, the experience of being the one person in a room who disagrees with everyone else, remains constant regardless of domain expertise. The willingness to pay that social cost, rather than the ability to evaluate independently, is what expertise improves only marginally. This matters because the professional contexts in which we most rely on expert independence, medical diagnosis, legal judgment, scientific peer review, are exactly the contexts in which peer consensus is most systematically present and most systematically penalizes dissent. The expert is not immune. They are just slightly more resistant. Slightly more resistant is not the same as immune. Story 4 in April 1967. History teacher Ron Jones conducted an experiment at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California, that has since become one of the most discussed case studies in the psychology of authoritarian group dynamics. His sophomore class had been studying Germany and had asked a question Jones couldn't answer satisfactorily. How could ordinary German citizens claim they didn't know what was happening? How could they go along with it? Jones decided to show them rather than tell them. On Monday, he introduced a new movement, the third wave, built around 3 principles: strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. Students were required to sit at attention, respond to questions with standing and a crisp salute, address Jones as Mr. Jones rather than by first name. The response was enthusiastic. By Tuesday, he had introduced the idea of community, that third wave members were special, superior, part of something important. By Wednesday, students were reporting other students who violated the rules. By Thursday, the movement had over 200 student members who had joined voluntarily and whose commitment to the group identity was producing the behaviors Jones had intended only to illustrate: exclusion of non-members, hierarchical deference, unquestioned acceptance of authority. On Friday, Jones called a meeting telling students that the third wave was a national movement and they were about to see the announcement of their candidate for the presidency. He instead showed them footage of the Nuremberg rallies and told them what they had become. The experiment ran for 5 days and was ended by a teacher because he judged it was getting out of control. Several students had not understood it was an experiment. Story 5 Project Artichoke preceded MKUltra and in some ways was its more overtly operational ancestor, where MKUltra was largely a research program attempting to develop mind control techniques. Project Artichoke, which ran from 1951 to 1953 before being folded into MKUltra, was explicitly oriented toward operational use, toward developing the capability to make an individual do something they would not do voluntarily and could not afterwards fully remember. The specific operational goal that drove Project Artichoke was the production of what CIA documents call a Manchurian candidate, an individual who could be conditioned to carry out an act, including violence, on command, and who could be credibly programmed with false memories or subjected to amnesia that would prevent them from disclosing what they'd done. The methods explored included hypnosis, combined with drugs including barbiturates, amphetamines, and, eventually, LSD. Subjects included prisoners, patients in hospitals, and in some cases foreign nationals, detained in undisclosed locations. The documentation of Artichoke that survived the 1973 destruction of MKUltra records includes specific references to experiments testing whether hypnotized subjects could be induced to perform acts they would refuse when fully conscious. Project Artichoke documents, partially declassified through the 1970s Church Committee hearings and subsequent FOIA requests, describe experiments in Germany, Japan, and at multiple U.S. locations. The full picture of what was tested, on whom, and with what results remains incomplete because CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most relevant records in 1973, 2 days after the Watergate-era investigations began closing in on the intelligence community. Story 6, The Cyranoid Experiment, was developed by Stanley Milgram, who also gave us the obedience studies, and has been extended by subsequent researchers to produce some of the most unsettling findings in social psychology about how we attribute intelligence, personality, and authentic selfhood to the people we're talking to. The basic setup, named for Cyrano de Bergerac, who spoke for someone else, one person interacts with a second person, while a third person, located elsewhere, speaks the words that the second person lip-syncs or repeats via hidden earpiece. The interacting person believes they're in conversation with the person in front of them. They're actually in conversation with someone they can't see, whose words are coming through a body that's physically present but intellectually elsewhere. Milgram's original version had adults shadow for children, and adults' words coming from a child's mouth, and found that people still attributed the intelligence and personality of the words to the child. They formed impressions of the child as thoughtful and mature, based on the adult's speech, without suspecting anything unusual. Researcher Kevin O'Regan has extended the Cyranoid paradigm to explore what it reveals about the attribution of personhood. We attribute mind, personality, and authentic self to the body in front of us, not to the mind actually generating the communication. We are fooled by physical presence into making attributions that the actual causal structure of the interaction doesn't support. Applied to the present, you routinely have conversations with entities whose words are generated by systems you can't see and attributed to faces or voices that serve as the physical interface. The Cyranoid isn't a thought experiment about deception. It's a description of what a significant portion of contemporary communication already looks like. Story 7 sensory deprivation research began in earnest at McGill University in the 1950s under John Lilly and Donald Hebb, motivated initially by practical questions about what happened to soldiers, pilots, and sailors in monotonous environments with limited sensory input. The findings were striking enough to generate significant military and intelligence interest. The basic experimental design: participants were placed in conditions of extreme sensory monotony, lying on a bed in a soundproofed room, hands covered in cardboard cylinders to reduce tactile sensation, translucent goggles to eliminate patterned visual input. They were paid to stay as long as they could. Most participants could not stay beyond a few days. The experience was not peaceful. Within hours, participants began experiencing perceptual distortions, difficulty concentrating, inability to think clearly or maintain focus on any mental task for extended periods. Within longer periods, the perceptual distortions became more severe, vivid hallucinations, both visual and auditory, that participants reported as indistinguishable from genuine perception. Emotional disturbance was common. Several participants became acutely frightened. The research established that the human brain requires continuous, varied sensory input to maintain normal functioning. In the absence of external input, the brain does not rest. It generates its own input, producing the hallucinations and perceptual distortions that participants reported. The normal architecture of experience, which we take to be an accurate reflection of an external world, turns out to depend on constant external calibration to remain stable. The findings were taken seriously by the CIA because they suggested that extended isolation, applied deliberately and with control over the environment, could produce significant psychological disruption without any physical intervention. Isolation was a tool. The mind would do the damage to itself. prison systems use isolation routinely. The research on what it produces has been consistent since the 1950s. Story 8: The Clark doll tests, conducted by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1940s, used a specific, elegant methodology to measure the psychological effects of racial segregation on Black children's self-concept. The method: children were shown two dolls identical in every respect except skin color, one white, one brown, and asked a series of questions. Which doll is nice? Which is bad? Which looks like you? Which would you like to play with? The findings were consistent and striking. A majority of Black children, when asked which doll was nice or which they wanted to play with, chose the white doll. When asked which doll was bad, they chose the brown doll. When asked which doll looked like them, they chose the brown doll, and then, in some documented cases, showed visible distress at having made the connection. The Clarks interpreted these findings as evidence that racial segregation had produced a specific psychological damage in Black children, a learned association between their own racial identity and negative qualities, and between white racial identity and positive ones. The children had internalized the hierarchy that segregation enforced. The doll tests were cited as evidence in the NASP's legal briefs and entered the historical record in 1954, when the Supreme Court cited them in Brown v. Board of Education. Chief Justice Warren's majority opinion referenced the psychological harm of segregation specifically, drawing partly on the Clark's research. The doll tests contributed to the legal finding that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. The research that changed American constitutional law was simple enough to conduct in a classroom and devastating enough in its implications to reframe a legal argument that had failed for decades. Story 9: In a completely darkened room, a stationary point of light appears to move. This is the autokinetic effect, an optical illusion produced by the absence of any visual reference frame, causing small eye movements to be perceived as movement of the light source itself. The movement isn't real. Each person who experiences it sees different movement because the illusion is generated by their individual visual system. Muzaffar Sharif used this illusion in the 1930s to study something far more significant than visual perception: how groups create shared reality. First, participants estimated how much the light moved when alone. They produced individual, idiosyncratic estimates. Some said 2 inches, some said 12. Estimates varied widely and consistently. Then participants were placed in groups and asked to call out their estimates in sequence. Over multiple trials, the group estimates converged, not toward some objective truth, because there was none, but toward a shared norm that the group had generated together. Most strikingly, when participants who had developed a shared group norm were subsequently tested alone, they maintained the group norm rather than returning to their original individual estimate. The shared reality had replaced the individual one. The autokinetic effect research is foundational to our understanding of social norm formation. The specific mechanism by which groups establish shared beliefs in domains where objective information is unavailable or ambiguous. In ambiguous situations, what we perceive as reality is substantially a product of what the people around us tell us they perceive. The implications were understood immediately by Sharif. If this happens with optical illusions, it happens with social, political, and moral judgments where the ambiguity is even greater and the social stakes of conforming are considerably higher. Story 10: In 1972, psychologist David Rosenhan and 7 healthy collaborators gained admission to 12 different psychiatric hospitals in 5 U.S. states by reporting a single symptom. They heard a voice saying empty, hollow, or thud. Once admitted, all pseudo-patients immediately stopped reporting any symptoms and behaved completely normally. They then attempted to get discharged by demonstrating their sanity. It was much harder than they expected. The average hospitalization lasted 19 days. The longest was 52 days. During their stays, the pseudo-patients took notes. Nursing staff recorded their note-taking as symptom behavior. Patient engages in writing behavior. The diagnosis of schizophrenia they'd received on admission attached to all subsequent observations. Normal behavior was interpreted through the diagnostic lens. When a nurse observed one pseudo-patient pacing the hallway, the nursing notes recorded it as anxiety related to his diagnosis. Real patients, Rosenhan noted, were often better at detecting the pseudo-patient's sanity than the staff were. "You're not crazy," several real patients told them. "You're a journalist or a professor." Rosenhan published the findings in Science under the title "On Being Sane in Insane Places." The finding, that psychiatric diagnosis, once applied, shaped all subsequent perception of the patient in ways that made the diagnosis self-confirming, was explosive. The psychiatric establishment was furious. The establishment of one hospital challenged Rosenhan to send pseudo-patients to their facility, saying their trained staff would detect them. Rosenhan agreed. The hospital identified 41 pseudo-patients out of 193 admissions with high confidence. Rosenhan then revealed he had sent no one. The study's specific methodology has since been criticized, but its core finding, that context and labeling shape clinical observation more than many practitioners acknowledge, has proven durable. Story 11: The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The U.S. government watched 400 men die of an untreatable disease that became treatable. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is one of the most extensively documented and most consequential ethics violations in the history of American medical research. It ran for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, involved the U.S. Public Health Service, and resulted in the preventable deaths of numerous participants and lasting damage to the relationship between Black American communities and medical institutions that persists in documented form to the present day. The study enrolled 399 Black men from Macon County, Alabama, who had syphilis, and 201 uninfected men as controls. Participants were not told they had syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term for various ailments. The study's purpose was to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men, driven by the scientific racism of the period, which held that syphilis progressed differently in Black patients than white patients. When penicillin was established as an effective treatment for syphilis in 1947, 15 years into the study, the participants were not offered treatment. The study continued. When participants were called up for military service during World War II, the Public Health Service intervened to ensure they were not treated for syphilis by military medical personnel. When community organizations offered mobile treatment programs in the area, study organizers worked to ensure participants were excluded. The study continued for 25 more years after a definitive cure became available. It ended only when a Public Health Service whistleblower, Peter Buxton, provided documents to the press in 1972. The resulting coverage ended the study and contributed to the development of the federal regulations governing human subjects research that are now in place. The study's legacy in documented medical mistrust among Black Americans is measurable in reduced engagement with preventive care and clinical trials, harm that continues to affect health outcomes decades after the study ended. Story 12: The Harvard Stress Room. Henry Murray ran psychological torture sessions on an undergraduate named Ted Kaczynski beginning in 1959. When Ted Kaczynski was a 16-year-old freshman at Harvard, he participated in a psychological research program run by Henry Murray, a prominent Harvard psychologist and one of the architects of the Office of Strategic Services Wartime Psychological Assessment Program that subsequent analysis has identified as bearing the hallmarks of CIA-affiliated research into psychological stress and personality disintegration. The specific protocol, Kaczynski and other undergraduate participants were told they would be engaged in a philosophical debate as part of a study on their beliefs. What they experienced instead was systematic humiliation. Participants wrote essays expressing their personal values and beliefs. They were then attacked aggressively, extensively, with personal specificity by a law student trained to be abusive. The sessions were filmed. Participants were later shown the footage of themselves being humiliated. The study ran for 3 years. participants were interviewed at multiple points by Murray's team. Whether Murray's research was directly CIA-funded is not definitively established. The connection is inferred from Murray's background, the specific protocols used, and the research's apparent alignment with the kind of personality under stress study that interested the CIA during the MKUltra period. The connection between Kaczynski's participation in Murray's study and his subsequent development as the Unabomber, who targeted universities and technology companies in a bombing campaign lasting 17 years and killing 3 people, has been discussed by several writers and criminologists without producing a consensus on causality. Kaczynski participated in the study as a late adolescent during what appears to have been a critical developmental period. He described the experience in writing. Murray died in 1988. His papers are at Harvard's archive. Kaczynski died in prison in 2023. Story 13, The Lost Letter Experiment. How Stanley Milgram measured hidden prejudice across an entire city. Stanley Milgram, who also designed the obedience studies and the Cyranoid experiment, establishing himself as the most creative and ethically complex social psychologist of the 20th century, developed the lost letter technique in the 1960s as a method for measuring the private attitudes of a population without asking them directly. The method was disarmingly simple. Addressed, stamped envelopes were dropped in public locations, on sidewalks, in phone booths, on park benches, as if accidentally lost by their owners. The letters were addressed to different organizations, legitimate charities, neutral businesses, and politically charged organizations including Friends of the German Party and Friends of the Communist Party. The measure was the return rate. What percentage of people who found a lost letter mailed it? The findings. Most people mailed letters addressed to neutral organizations. Far fewer mailed letters addressed to politically charged organizations. The return rate for letters addressed to organizations the finder apparently disliked was significantly lower than for organizations they were neutral toward. The technique measured behavior. Did you mail the letter? Rather than stated attitude. It produced a picture of the private, unmonitored prejudices of a population in a specific place and time, expressed through the small act of choosing whether to help or not help, based on who the help would go to. The lost letter technique has been replicated across multiple countries and time periods and continues to be used in modified forms. It established a principle with broad applications. People's private attitudes are more reliably revealed by small, low-stakes behavioral choices than by direct questions, because low-stakes choices don't trigger the social performance that direct questions do. What you do when no one is watching is more informative than what you say you'd do. Story 14, The Smoke-Filled Room. People ignored evidence of an emergency because others ignored it too, the bystander effect. The documented phenomenon in which individuals are less likely to offer help in an emergency when other people are present than when they're alone was established through a specific series of experiments conducted by John Darley and Bibb Latané in the late 1960s. The smoke-filled room study is one of the cleanest demonstrations. Participants were brought into a room and given questionnaires to fill out. While they were filling out the forms, smoke began entering the room through a vent, enough smoke to be clearly visible, building over the several minutes of the study. The question was whether participants would report the smoke. Alone, people reported the smoke quickly. Most alone participants left the room within a few minutes. In groups, the response was dramatically different. When participants were seated with 2 other people who were actually confederates of the experimenter, instructed to ignore the smoke, return to their questionnaires, and act unconcerned, most participants did nothing for the full 6 minutes of the study, continuing to fill out questionnaires while the room filled with smoke. The specific mechanism is the combination of 2 effects: pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility. Both effects produce inaction, and they reinforce each other. The smoke-filled room is one of the experiments that most directly challenges the self-conception of people who believe they would act in emergencies. Most of them wouldn't, if they're in a group, and the group dynamics that produce inaction are invisible from inside them. Story 15, Operation Mockingbird's Domestic Reach. The CIA placed stories in American newspapers, and nobody was told Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's documented program of cultivating relationships with American journalists, editors, and media executives, had a specific domestic propaganda dimension that the 1975 Church Committee hearings established in detail. And that deserves its own examination separate from the international context in which some of its activities were easier to contextualize. The domestic question. The CIA's charter explicitly limited its operations to foreign intelligence gathering and prohibited domestic operations. The cultivation of relationships with American journalists was, on its face, a domestic operation. The CIA's response to this tension was a specific legal argument that placing information with American journalists for publication was not a domestic operation if the primary purpose was to influence foreign audiences. If the story appeared in the New York Times and was subsequently picked up by foreign press, the operation was technically aimed at those foreign audiences. This legal argument was considered internally and accepted internally. Whether it represents a legitimate interpretation of the CIA's charter or a self-serving reading designed to enable prohibited domestic propaganda is the legal question that the Church Committee raised and that was never definitively resolved. The specific documented practice, CIA officers with journalist relationships would provide stories, sometimes accurate and sometimes shaped to present specific conclusions, which the journalists would publish under their own bylines. Readers had no way to know the source of the information. The journalists' credibility authenticated the content. The CIA's role was invisible. Frank Church's committee identified some prominent American journalists who had received CIA payments for these services. The full list was not made public. The specific stories that originated with the CIA and were published as independent journalism are not comprehensively documented in any public record. The program was officially terminated in 1976. Story 16, The Jigsaw Classroom, the technique that reduced prejudice by making groups depend on each other in 1971. Social psychologist Elliot Aronson was approached by the Austin, Texas school district, which had recently desegregated and was experiencing significant intergroup conflict. Black, white, and Hispanic students were not getting along, and competitive classroom dynamics, in which individual students competed for teacher attention and grades, were reinforcing rather than reducing the tensions. Aronson designed the Jigsaw Classroom as a structural intervention. The method: divide the class into small, diverse groups. Divide the lesson's material into sections equal to the number of group members. Each student is responsible for one section, their piece of the jigsaw. To learn the full material, each group member must teach their section to the others. Each student is therefore simultaneously an expert on their piece and dependent on every other group member for the rest. The effect of this structure was specific and measurable. Students in Jigsaw classrooms developed more positive attitudes toward students of other racial groups. They showed improved academic performance compared to students in conventional competitive classrooms, particularly minority students who had been disadvantaged by competitive dynamics. They developed more empathy for other students' perspectives. The mechanism is the reduction of outgroup threat through enforced interdependence. When your grade depends on a black student teaching you their section effectively, that student's success is aligned with your success rather than in competition with it. The structural change in the relationship changed the interpersonal dynamics. Jigsaw classroom techniques have been implemented in thousands of schools across multiple countries. The evidence base for their effectiveness in reducing prejudice and improving academic outcomes is substantial. Aronson regarded it as the most practically important work of his career. The experiment proved something valuable. You can reduce prejudice by changing the structure of the situation rather than the minds of the people in it. Story 17, The Choice Blindness Lab. People will defend choices they never made and don't remember making. Choice blindness is a phenomenon documented by Swedish psychologist Peter Johansson and colleagues in a series of experiments beginning in 2005 that produced one of the most consistently unsettling findings in The Psychology of Self-Knowledge, people will confidently explain and defend choices they never made. The original study used a card magic-style procedure. Participants were shown pairs of faces and asked which they found more attractive. After choosing, they were handed the photo of the person they had chosen, except in some trials, through sleight of hand. They were given the photo of the person they hadn't chosen. They were then asked to explain why they had chosen the face in their hand. The majority of swaps were not detected. And when asked to explain their choice, participants produced detailed, confident explanations for a decision they had never made. I chose this one because of their smile. I found this person's eyes more appealing. The explanations were constructed post hoc from the image in front of them and attributed to a decision process that hadn't produced the image they were now holding. The paradigm has been extended to preferences in jam tasting, consumer products, and political opinions. In the political version, participants were asked their opinions on policy issues, then shown a questionnaire with some opinions altered to be opposite to what they'd stated, and asked to elaborate on their positions. Most failed to detect the alteration. Most elaborated confidently on positions they had explicitly just rejected. The specific implication is uncomfortable. The story we tell about why we think what we think and chose what we chose is largely constructed after the fact, often inaccurately, and may bear little relationship to the actual processes that produced our behavior. Story 18, the sleeper effect. Propaganda from untrustworthy sources gets believed over time. The sleeper effect was first documented by Carl Hovland and Walter Weiss in 1951, and it describes a counterintuitive phenomenon in how we process persuasive information over time. Immediately after receiving a persuasive message, people discount it if the source is untrustworthy. But over time, the memory of the source fades while the memory of the content persists, and the discounting effect disappears. The message from the untrustworthy source becomes as persuasive as a message from a credible one. The specific finding: people who were exposed to a persuasive message from a credible source showed immediate attitude change. People exposed to the same message from a discredited source showed no immediate attitude change or less change. But when tested several weeks later, the difference between the groups had substantially narrowed. The people who received the message from the untrustworthy source had moved toward the message's position without remembering why they were skeptical. The practical implications for propaganda and misinformation are specific and were understood immediately by the researchers. A source that is known to be unreliable or hostile can transmit a message that will initially be rejected and subsequently believed, with no further action required, simply by waiting. The sleeper effect has been debated and qualified in subsequent research. Its reliability depends on specific conditions, including message strength and the nature of the discounting cue. But the core finding, that initial discounting based on source quality degrades over time while message content persists, has been replicated enough to be taken seriously. Every piece of misinformation you've encountered and initially rejected is still in your memory. Whether it's still discounted is the question. Story 19, the rumor clinic. Wartime researchers discovered how rumors mutate and who gets blamed during World War II. Psychologists Gordon Allport and Leo Postman conducted a systematic study of rumor transmission as part of the war effort to understand and counter propaganda. The resulting work, published as The Psychology of Rumor in 1947, established principles of how information distorts as it passes through social networks that remain foundational to our understanding of misinformation. The experimental method was simple. Participants were shown a complex image depicting a scene with multiple people, objects, and activities. They described it to a second participant who hadn't seen it. That person described it to a third. The chain continued for 5 to 6 transmissions, after which researchers compared the final account to the original image. The distortions followed predictable patterns. Details were lost. From the original dozens of details, the final account retained a fraction. The remaining details were simplified, made more internally consistent, and shifted toward culturally familiar frames. In the most disturbing consistent finding, When the original image contained a black man and a white man, one of whom was holding a razor blade, the final account often transferred the razor blade from the white man's hand to the black man's. Allport and Postman called this assimilation, the tendency of rumor content to conform to the expectations and stereotypes of the people transmitting it. People don't transmit what they see. They transmit their interpretation, shaped by what they expect to see, and the interpretation accumulates distortion at each step. The rumor clinic approach, public campaigns explaining how rumors spread and encourage people to trace rather than transmit rumors, was implemented during the war and is the ancestor of contemporary fact-checking organizations. The underlying pattern it was designed to address has not changed. Story 20 Operation Mockingbird. The CIA recruited and managed American journalists and media organizations for decades. Operation Mockingbird is the name applied to the CIA's documented program of recruiting American journalists, editors, and media executives to promote U.S. government perspectives, suppress information damaging to national interests, and gather intelligence through their professional networks. The program is confirmed by the 1975 Church Committee Senate investigation, by subsequent congressional testimony, and by declassified CIA documents. It is not a conspiracy theory. At its peak in the 1950s through 1970s, the CIA maintained relationships with reporters at most major American newspapers and wire services, several prominent media executives, and the leadership of several broadcast news organizations. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, and other prominent outlets had relationships with the CIA that ranged from occasional informal contact to systematic collaboration, according to documents and testimony from the period. The specific activities included placing CIA-prepared stories with journalists who published them under their own bylines, suppressing stories that the CIA judged damaging to national security interests, gathering intelligence from journalists' overseas sources, and, in some cases, using journalists as couriers and spotters for CIA operations. CIA Director William Colby told Congress in 1975 that the agency had at various times had available to it somewhere in the area of 400 American journalists who would occasionally help us. The word occasionally is doing significant work in that sentence. Frank Church's committee found that the CIA had paid some prominent American journalists for services rendered. The specific names of most of them have never been made fully public. The program was officially ended in 1976 by CIA Director George H.W. Bush. Whether any equivalent programs operated after that date is a question the available public documentation does not answer. Story 21 The Judas Goat Effect. Animals and people follow a leader into slaughter without knowing where they're going. A Judas goat is a trained animal, historically a goat, but also used with sheep, that has been conditioned to lead other animals calmly through a slaughterhouse facility to the killing floor. The other animals follow the Judas goat because they follow familiar leaders, because they read the calm behavior of the goat as a signal that the environment is safe, because their social instincts are stronger than their individual assessment of an unfamiliar place. The Judas goat is then diverted at the last moment. The animals it led are not. The psychological translation to human behavior is documented rather than merely metaphorical. The phenomenon of trusted figures leading populations toward outcomes those populations would reject if they understood them completely. Using the trust established in other domains, the calm demeanor that social reading interprets as a safety signal, the in-group identification that suppresses individual critical assessment, is a specific and recurring pattern in political and social history. Solomon Asch's conformity research, the Stanley Milgram obedience studies, the Sheriff autokinetic research, all of them document components of the Judas goat effect in human populations. We read social cues from those we trust as information about the safety or legitimacy of the situation we're in. The trusted leader, who seems calm in a situation that should produce alarm, suppresses our alarm. The in-group that follows seems to provide evidence that following is correct. The specific application in contemporary contexts, influencer culture, cult dynamics, political movements, all of them depend on the same mechanism. The trusted figure leads calmly. The group follows. The individual suppresses the alarm that independent assessment would produce. The question of where you're going is answered by where the Judas goat seems willing to go. Not all leaders are Judas goats. The problem is that from inside the following, you can't tell. Story 22, the foot in the door study. The 1966 experiment that proved small agreements create big compliance, the Friedman and Fraser foot in the door experiment of 1966, is one of the most replicated findings in social psychology and one with the most direct applications to commercial and political persuasion. The original study was conducted in a California suburb, used homeowners as participants, and produced results that changed how sales psychology is practiced. The setup: experimenters called homeowners and asked them either a small initial request or a large direct request. Weeks after the small request group had complied, they were asked the large request. The findings: 76% of homeowners who had complied with the small request agreed to the large, ugly lawn sign. Only 17% of those who received the large request without prior contact agreed. Prior compliance with a small request more than quadrupled compliance with a large subsequent request. The mechanism is self-perception. Once you've done something, you incorporate that behavior into your identity. You're now someone who supports this cause, agrees with this person, cooperates with this organization. The subsequent larger request arrives not as a new imposition, but as an opportunity to behave consistently with who you now understand yourself to be. The sales and political applications were immediate. Free trials, small initial donations, loyalty program sign-ups, online petitions, all of them establish prior compliance that can be leveraged for subsequent larger asks. The technique is taught in sales training globally. The research behind it is explicitly cited. You have been foot in the door. The specific questions are when, by whom, and to what end. Story 23, the door in the face study. Ask for something ridiculous first and people will say yes to what you actually want. Robert Cialdini and his colleagues conducted the foundational door in the face study in 1975. And the specific experimental design is worth knowing in detail because it's cleaner and more counterintuitive than the foot in the door research it complements. The experiment: participants were approached on a college campus and asked either a large request directly or the large request following an extreme initial request. The extreme request: would you be willing to serve as an unpaid counselor for juvenile delinquents at a local detention center 2 hours a week for 2 years? Virtually everyone refused. The follow-up request, presented as a concession: well, would you be willing to take a group of juvenile delinquents on a 2-hour trip to the zoo? The compliance rate for the zoo trip was 3 times higher when preceded by the 2-year counselor request than when the zoo trip was the first and only request. The same zoo trip, asked cold, 17% compliance. Asked after the 2-year commitment was refused, 50%. 2 mechanisms produce this effect. Reciprocal concession: the requester appears to have made a concession from their original position, and social norms create pressure to reciprocate with compliance. Perceptual contrast: the smaller request looks dramatically more reasonable when compared to the extreme initial request than when evaluated independently. The door-in-the-face technique is standard in negotiation training, in sales training, and in political lobbying. The initial extreme position makes the real position appear moderate. Starting salary negotiations, policy demands, treaty positions, all of them routinely use the extreme opening as an anchor for what the requester actually wants. The next time someone makes a request that sounds unreasonable, notice whether it's followed by a smaller one. Story 24, the nudge field trials. Governments discovered they could change mass behavior without anyone noticing nudge theory. The application of behavioral economics to public policy, formalized by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in their 2008 book, proposes that the architecture of choices can be designed to make certain outcomes more likely without prohibiting any option. The canonical example: Placing healthy food at eye level in a cafeteria increases healthy food selection without removing the unhealthy options. What began as an academic framework has become operational government policy across multiple countries. The UK established a behavioral insights team in 2010, the first government organization specifically dedicated to applying nudge principles to policy. The United States, Australia, the Netherlands, Singapore, and many other countries have followed with equivalent organizations. The field trials have produced specific, documented results. Redesigning the layout of tax letters increased payment compliance significantly. Adding social norm messaging to energy bills reduced energy consumption. Changing the default setting on organ donation forms from opt-in to opt-out increased donor registration dramatically. The specific ethical tension in nudge policy is about consent and transparency. A nudge, by definition, works better when it's not noticed. If you know that the healthy food is at eye level because someone designed it that way to influence your choice, the effect is reduced. The effectiveness of behavioral policy is partly a function of its invisibility. This means governments are deploying evidence-based techniques to change their citizens' behavior in ways that work specifically because the citizens aren't aware they're being influenced. The policy intention is generally benign: improve health outcomes, increase tax compliance, reduce energy use. The mechanism is the same one used by less benign actors. You are being nudged. The specific direction depends on who designed the choice architecture you're currently in. Story 25: The Halo Effect Experiments. One positive trait makes everything about a person seem better. The halo effect. The documented tendency for a positive impression in one area to influence impressions in unrelated areas was named and first systematically studied by Edward Thorndike in 1920. Who found that military officers' ratings of their soldiers on one trait were highly correlated with their ratings on unrelated traits in ways that couldn't be explained by actual correlations between those traits. The officers were letting their overall impression of a soldier, shaped by whatever trait they most readily noticed, bleed into every specific judgment they made about that soldier. The good soldier was good at everything. The bad soldier was bad at everything. The correlations were not in the soldiers. They were in the rater's mind. Subsequent research has established the halo effect as one of the most robust and pervasive cognitive biases in human evaluation. Attractive people are rated as more intelligent, more honest, and more competent than less attractive people in ways that have no empirical basis in actual differences in intelligence, honesty, or competence. Tall political candidates receive higher estimates of leadership ability. Fluent writers are assumed to have more expertise on the topics they write about. Well-dressed individuals are trusted more. The halo effect operates in hiring decisions, judicial sentencing, classroom grading, and romantic attraction. Studies of judicial sentencing have found that defendants who are rated more attractive by independent evaluators receive shorter sentences for the same crimes. Studies of classroom grading have found that student essays attributed to more attractive photographs of students receive higher grades from raters who can't see the actual essays. Physical presentation generates halos. Halos generate systematically distorted evaluation. The distortion is documented and robust. It does not feel like distortion from inside. Story 26: The False Confession Room. Innocent people confess to crimes that didn't happen. Saul Kassan and his colleagues have produced a body of research over several decades demonstrating that false confessions are not rare anomalies in the criminal justice system, but systematic products of specific interrogation techniques that produce confessions from innocent people with documented reliability. The false memory component, a specific paradigm used in research, had participants complete a typing task, then accuse them of causing a computer crash by pressing a key they had been told not to press. They had not done this. Under an interrogation condition in which another participant claimed to have seen them press the key, 65% of innocent participants signed a false confession admitting to having crashed the computer. The real-world parallel, read technique interrogation, The dominant interrogation method taught to U.S. law enforcement for decades involves presuming guilt, confronting the suspect with evidence of their guilt, and offering minimization, the suggestion that confessing will produce better outcomes. Extended interrogation under these conditions produces false confessions from innocent people at rates documented in both laboratory and real-world data. The Innocence Project, which has used DNA evidence to exonerate individuals wrongfully convicted, has found that approximately 25% of cases involving DNA exoneration included a false confession or incriminating statement as evidence in the original conviction. A quarter of people exonerated by DNA evidence had confessed to something they did not do. The mechanism isn't stupidity or weakness. Laboratory false confessions occur in participants with normal intelligence under conditions of minor pressure relative to what actual criminal interrogation produces. The specific interrogation context produces the confession in innocent people reliably. Story 27, The Invisible Gorilla Test. We miss obvious things when we're not looking for them in 1999. Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons published what became one of the most widely known findings in cognitive psychology. Participants watching a video of people passing basketballs, instructed to count the passes, missed a person in a gorilla suit who walked through the scene, stopped in the center, thumped their chest, and walked off. Approximately half of all participants who watched the video failed to notice the gorilla. Not because the gorilla was small or brief, it was visible for about 9 seconds in the center of the scene, but because their attentional resources were occupied counting passes, there was no attention available for unexpected objects, even conspicuous unexpected objects. Chabris and Simons called this inattentional blindness, the specific failure to perceive clearly visible stimuli that you're not looking for. The gorilla is not absent from your visual field. It's absent from your conscious awareness because your attention was directed elsewhere. The practical implications are significant and somewhat alarming. Radiologists who are looking for cancer miss incidental findings that should be clinically significant. Police officers focused on a suspect miss other relevant details. Drivers paying attention to traffic miss pedestrians who weren't where drivers were trained to look. The professional context, the trained expertise, the focused attention doesn't eliminate inattentional blindness. In some cases, it creates the specific attentional allocation that produces it. The more you know about what you're looking for, the less you see of what you're not looking for. Expertise in one domain can produce systematic blindness in adjacent ones. The gorilla that walks through your specific visual field while you're counting passes will be missed. Half the people who see this experiment still miss the gorilla. Story 28, The Elevator Conformity Films. People changed which way they faced because strangers did in the 1960s. Candid Camera, the hidden camera television program, filmed a version of conformity research in an elevator that has become one of the most widely shown illustrations of social conformity in introductory psychology courses. The footage is simple, immediately comprehensible, and consistently produces a specific uncomfortable laugh in audiences who watch it. A participant enters an elevator and faces the door, as people do in elevators. The other people in the elevator, confederates of the program, turn to face the back wall. The participant, after a moment of visible uncertainty, turns to face the back wall too. The confederates turn to face a side wall. The participant turns to face the side wall. The confederates turn to face the door. The participant turns back to face the door. The participant changes orientation in the elevator against their normal behavior and their own judgment multiple times because the social majority is doing something different from what they're doing. This is not a finding about weakness or stupidity. The people filmed were ordinary adults who, under other circumstances, exercised independent judgment constantly. In the elevator, where the stakes were low, the time pressure was immediate, and the alternative involved a mild social discomfort. Conformity was the path of least resistance, and they took it. Solomon Asch's conformity research with line judgments established the same finding under more controlled conditions. People will state things they know to be false, because the majority in the room is stating them. The elevator footage puts a face on the research. The face is one of polite, baffled compliance, performing the socially expected thing in a small, enclosed space for no reason. Story 29, The Obedience Box. Revisited. Modern replications of Milgram have found the same results. Stanley Milgram's 1961 obedience experiments are the most famous studies in the history of social psychology and among the most controversial in terms of their ethical conduct and their implications for human nature. In the standard procedure, participants were instructed by an authority figure to administer electric shocks of increasing intensity to a learner in an adjacent room in response to incorrect answers. The shocks were not real. The screaming was recorded. The learner was not harmed. Approximately 65% of participants administered the maximum shock level, labeled 450 volts on the shock generator. The methodological and ethical criticisms of the original studies are extensive and legitimate. The deception was extreme. The debriefing was in some cases inadequate, and some participants reported lasting psychological distress. The studies also took place during a specific historical moment, shortly after the Nuremberg trials, during the peak of public consciousness about how ordinary people had participated in atrocities that shaped both Milgram's questions and his participants' context. What makes the revisiting of this research specifically worth examining: multiple partial replications using modified protocols that stop at a 150 volts have found obedience rates similar to Milgram's original findings. A 2009 replication by Jerry Berger found 70% compliance to the 150 volt point, comparable to Milgram's rate. The finding has not been refuted by history. The conditions that Milgram documented, authority, legitimacy, gradualism, physical separation from the person being harmed, continue to produce the behavior he documented. The historical context has changed. The finding has not. Story 30, The Good Samaritan Seminary Study. Theology students stepped over a collapsed man when they were in a hurry in 1973. John Darley and C. Daniel Batson conducted one of the most theologically pointed experiments in social psychology, using students at Princeton Theological Seminary as participants and a parable about helping as the experimental content. Participants were told they would give a short talk on either the Good Samaritan parable or seminary job prospects. Before giving the talk, they were sent across campus to another building. Some were told they were late. Some were told they were on time. Some were told they had plenty of time. On the route between buildings, a Confederate was slumped in a doorway, head down, eyes closed, not moving. As participants passed, the Confederate coughed twice. Helping was strongly predicted by one variable: how much of a hurry participants were in. Of those who were told they had ample time, 63% stopped to help. Of those who were told they were on time, 45% helped. Of those who were told they were late, only 10% helped. The content of the talk they were about to give, whether they had just been thinking about the Good Samaritan story, made essentially no difference. The person who had been thinking about charity and stopped to help an injured man on the road stepped over an apparently collapsed person to get to their engagement. Situational pressure, the simple fact of being late, overwhelmed the moral content that was literally their current focus. This is the finding that made the Good Samaritan study famous. Not that seminary students are hypocrites, but that situation is a more powerful determinant of moral behavior than character, intention, or recent moral priming. Story 31, The Learned Helplessness Cages. Animals and people stop trying when they learn that trying doesn't help. Martin Seligman's learned helplessness research, conducted initially in dogs in the 1960s and subsequently extended to humans, produced one of the most important and most disturbing findings in the psychology of depression and motivation. The original animal studies, dogs were placed in a shuttle box and subjected to electric shocks. One group could escape the shocks by pressing a panel. The other group received shocks of identical intensity and pattern, but had no control over them. The shocks occurred regardless of what they did. Later, all dogs were placed in a different apparatus where they could escape shocks by jumping over a low barrier. The dogs who had previously had control over their shocks learned to escape quickly. The dogs who had previously had no control over their shocks mostly lay down and didn't try, even when escape was readily available. The learned helplessness had transferred from the uncontrollable situation to a new situation where control was available. They had learned that their actions didn't matter, and they applied that lesson universally. The human parallel was established through subsequent research and has been influential in understanding depression. People who experience repeated situations in which their actions produce no effect on outcomes, regardless of the specific domain, can develop generalized helplessness, a state in which they stop taking action even in situations where their actions would be effective. Seligman subsequently developed the concept of learned optimism as the antidote, based on the finding that the explanatory style people use to account for bad events, whether they attribute them to permanent, pervasive, personal causes, predicts both depressive vulnerability and helplessness generalization. The cages in which helplessness is learned are not always metal. Story 32. The Authority Letter Study. People performed harmful acts when written instructions said to the authority letter experiment is a less well-known variation in the tradition of Milgram-style obedience research that strips away the in-person authority figure and examines whether written instructions from a parent authority source are sufficient to produce compliance with requests that participants would normally refuse. The experimental design: participants receive instructions via letter on institutional letterhead from an apparently authoritative source in various versions, a university department, a professional organization, or a government agency, requesting that they perform specific tasks. Some tasks are neutral. Some tasks, escalating through the sequence, are things participants would be expected to question or refuse in the absence of the authorizing document. The findings across several versions of this paradigm: written institutional authority is significantly more effective at producing compliance than the requester's actual authority warrants. The presence of formal letterhead, specific credential references, and the framing of the request as part of an official procedure all substantially increase compliance with requests that would be refused if the same person made them casually without the institutional apparatus. The mechanism is the same as Milgram's in-person authority effect. The institutional framing transfers moral responsibility from the actor to the institution. You are following a procedure. The institution has determined that this procedure is appropriate. Your individual assessment of the specific act is subordinated to the institutional sanction. This finding has specific practical implications for understanding how bureaucratic systems produce harmful outcomes without any individual member of the bureaucracy making a decision to cause harm. Each person follows the procedure. The procedure is authorized. The harm is distributed across the institutional chain in a way that no individual step feels morally decisive. The letter said to. The institution authorized it. The harm happened. Story 33. Harlow's Wire Mothers. What happens to a primate that has no one to hold Harry Harlow's research with rhesus monkeys in the 1950s and 1960s is remembered as one of the foundational contributions to attachment psychology and one of the most ethically difficult bodies of research in the history of the discipline. The experiments were genuinely illuminating and genuinely cruel, and both things are true simultaneously. The original wire mother studies, infant monkeys were placed in cages containing two surrogate mothers, one made of wire mesh that provided food through a bottle, one covered in soft cloth that provided warmth and texture but no food. The prevailing theory, derived from behaviorist reinforcement models, predicted that the infant would become attached to the food source. The opposite was found. Infants spent the vast majority of their time clinging to the cloth mother and used the wire mother only to feed, running back to the cloth mother afterward. When frightened, they ran to the cloth mother, even if doing so required passing the wire mother. Contact comfort, the physical experience of being held, was more fundamental to attachment than food. This finding directly contradicted the dominant theory of infant attachment and contributed to the research that eventually produced Bowlby's attachment theory. Harlow's subsequent research was darker. He created the pit of despair. a stainless steel chamber that isolated monkeys completely for periods of weeks or months to study the effects of total isolation. The isolated monkeys developed what would in humans be described as profound psychological damage, self-mutilation, social withdrawal, inability to engage normally with other monkeys. The research proved something important about what social connection means to primate psychology. The method of proving it is something the discipline continues to reckon with. Story 34: Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. A third-grade teacher gave her students a lesson in discrimination they remembered for life on April 5, 1968. The morning after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, elementary school teacher Jane Elliott walked into her third-grade classroom in Riceville, Iowa, and began what would become the most widely replicated classroom exercise in the history of anti-prejudice education. Elliott told her students that brown-eyed people were smarter, cleaner, and better than blue-eyed people. Blue-eyed students were required to wear fabric collars so they could be easily identified. They were forbidden from drinking from the same water fountain as brown-eyed students. They were told to sit in the back of the classroom. The transformation was rapid and specific. Brown-eyed students, previously unremarkable in academic performance, improved their performance on reading cards. Blue-eyed students, previously unremarkable, made mistakes they had not previously made and began describing themselves in the diminished terms of Elliott's framing. On the second day, Elliott reversed the exercise. Brown-eyed students became the denigrated group. The pattern repeated. The newly elevated group improved. The newly denigrated group declined. When Elliott reversed the exercise and debriefed the class, students destroyed the collars. Several cried. The lesson had been experiential rather than abstract, and the distress the students expressed was the distress of having lived, briefly, in the condition they were being taught about. Elliott has continued running variations of this exercise with adults in corporate diversity training and other contexts for decades. Participants in adult versions show the same rapid transformation in behavior and self-report. The mechanism is the same. Only the age of the participants changes. Story 35: The Robbers Cave Summer Camp. Boys were turned into warring tribes and then reconciled in 3 weeks. Muzaffar Sharif's Robbers Cave experiment in 1954 is the most comprehensive field study of intergroup conflict in the history of social psychology, conducted at a summer camp in Oklahoma with 22 11-year-old boys who didn't know they were in an experiment. Phase 1. The researchers divided the boys into 2 groups, kept separate for the first week. The groups developed identities, the Eagles and the Rattlers, with group norms, group names, and group pride, without knowledge of the other group's existence. Phase 2. The researchers introduced the groups to each other through competitive activities. The competition rapidly produced genuine intergroup hostility, derogatory nicknames, raiding of each other's cabins, burning of the other group's flag, and the kind of specific contempt that requires specific provocation. Phase 3. Sheriff attempted to reduce the hostility. Simply bringing the groups into contact, shared meals, shared movies, did not work. It produced more conflict. What worked was the introduction of superordinate goals, problems that required both groups to cooperate because neither could solve them alone. The water supply to the camp was sabotaged. Both groups had to work together to fix it. A truck got stuck and required all the boys to pull it free. Over several cooperative problem-solving experiences, the intergroup hostility reduced substantially. Boys who had been enemies began choosing each other as friends across group lines. The Robbers Cave experiment produced 3 findings. Groups form rapidly with minimal input, competition produces genuine hostility quickly, and that hostility can be reduced through forced cooperation on shared problems. All 3 findings have been replicated and extended in subsequent research. Story 36: The Line Judgment Test. People say things they know are wrong because everyone else is saying them. Solomon Asch's conformity research, conducted in the early 1950s, used the simplest possible perceptual task to demonstrate something profound about the relationship between social pressure and stated belief. Participants were shown a line and asked to match its length to one of 3 other lines, a task with a clear, unambiguous, correct answer that participants could easily identify when alone. Then, Ash placed each participant in a group with 7 to 9 Confederates who were instructed to give obviously incorrect answers on certain trials. The participant answered last or nearly last, after hearing everyone else give the wrong answer. The results, participants conformed to the incorrect majority answer on approximately 37% of critical trials. In a no-pressure control condition where participants answered alone, the error rate was less than 1%. Social pressure from a unanimous incorrect majority increased error rates from under 1% to 37%. More striking, in post-experiment interviews, participants gave different accounts of why they had gone along with the majority. Some said they had genuinely come to doubt their own perception, that the agreement of the group had made them wonder if they were seeing the lines correctly. Some said they had seen the lines correctly but hadn't wanted to stand out. Some said they knew the majority was wrong and had gone along anyway. Ash found that a single ally, one other person who gave the correct answer before the participant, dramatically reduced conformity. The solo dissident, even one, broke the unanimity that made conformity feel necessary. The implication for public discourse is direct, stated consensus is more powerful than evidence in shaping what people will say, and it takes very few voices of dissent to make independent statement possible again. Story 37, The Depatterning Ward. What the CIA's psychiatrist actually did to his patient's minds. Ewan Cameron's depatterning procedure, the technique funded by the CIA through Subproject 68, deserves its own entry separate from the broader MKUltra context because the specific nature of what was done to patients and the specific theory Cameron had about consciousness is one of the most disturbing applications of psychiatric authority in the 20th century. Cameron believed that certain psychiatric disorders were produced by patterns of memory and behavior that had become fixed and self-reinforcing. His theory, if you could erase those patterns completely, reduce the person to a kind of psychological blankness, you could then rebuild personality from scratch, writing new patterns in the clean space you'd created. The depatterning protocol was designed to create that blankness. Patients were put into drug-induced sleep for weeks or months at a time, using combinations of barbiturates and other sedatives. During sleep, they received electroconvulsive therapy at doses 2 to 4 times higher than the maximum therapeutic doses used for depression treatment, sometimes 3 times a day, 6 days a week. The goal was to produce retrograde amnesia severe enough that the patient lost access to who they were. It worked, in the narrow sense that it produced the amnesia Cameron sought. Patients emerged from depatterning regressed to states of infantile dependence, unable to state their name, unable to recognize family members, incontinent, unable to perform basic self-care. Some patients left the program in states of permanent psychological damage. The psychic driving phase, attempting to write new personality content into the blank space, did not work in any documentable way. The erasure happened. The rewriting did not follow. Patients were left with what had been removed from them, and nothing that had been promised in exchange. Story 38, The POW Confession Camps. How Chinese interrogators got American soldiers to sign false confessions during the Korean War. Chinese and North Korean forces produced something that American military and psychological authorities found deeply alarming. American prisoners of war who had signed confessions to having conducted biological warfare, who had made pro-communist broadcasts, who had in some cases simply been returned looking and behaving differently from when they had been captured. The American response to these confessions was initially to attribute them to drugs or torture, to assume that the only way a soldier would betray his country was through some extreme physical compulsion. The investigation that followed, conducted by psychiatrists and psychologists including Robert Lifton, produced a more disturbing finding. Most of the compliance had been achieved through psychological techniques that didn't involve significant physical coercion. The techniques, interrogation sessions held at unpredictable times that disrupted sleep and created chronic exhaustion. Gradual escalation of demands, starting with small ideological concessions and building incrementally. Social isolation, and then the provision of human contact as a reward for compliance. Reframing of compliance as consistent with the prisoner's own stated values. You said you don't want war, and signing this statement is a step toward peace. Public performance of compliance in front of other prisoners, after which social consistency pressure made further compliance easier. The program Robert Lifton called thought reform, and others would call brainwashing, was not primarily chemical or surgical. It was sequential, social, and psychological. It worked reliably enough across a population of normal, psychologically healthy military personnel to produce a pattern of compliance that the military establishment had not anticipated and could not attribute to prior psychological weakness in the soldiers concerned. The lesson the intelligence community drew from this research was operational. Story 39: The Uniform Effect. A specific costume changes how much power you're given and how you use it. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment is the most famous psychology study about the effects of role and uniform on behavior, and also the most methodologically contested subsequent investigation found significant problems with the experiment's conduct, including that guards were coached to behave harshly rather than spontaneously doing so, and that the role-playing nature of the situation was more consciously performed by participants than Zimbardo's "the situation took over" framing implied. But the broader research on uniform effects is more robust than the Stanford study, and its findings are specific and consistent. Leonard Bickman's studies in the 1970s found that a person in a guard's uniform was more likely to be obeyed when making requests of strangers than a person in civilian clothes, even when the uniform conferred no actual authority. People gave more money to a meter when a person in uniform asked them to than when the same person made the same request without uniform. Research on authority cues more broadly, white coats, police uniforms, business suits, judicial robes, consistently finds that the presence of visible authority markers changes both the behavior of the person wearing them and the response of people encountering them. The person in the uniform behaves with more authority. The people encountering the uniform grant more authority. Neither effect requires any assessment of whether the authority is legitimate. The mechanism is a heuristic. Uniforms are reliable predictors of authority in most everyday contexts, and using the heuristic saves cognitive effort. The error rate of the heuristic, the cases where it produces inappropriate deference, is low enough in ordinary life that the heuristic persists even when its application is exactly what someone manipulative would exploit. Story 40: The Compliance Ladder. Researchers mapped the exact sequence of small yeses that leads to anything. The compliance ladder is not a single study. It's the integrative framework that emerges when you line up the foot in the door research, the commitment and consistency findings of Cialdini, the identity behavior feedback loop documented in Bem's self-perception theory, and the gradual escalation techniques documented in studies of cult recruitment, coercive control, and institutional abuse. The ladder works like this. Each rung is a commitment slightly larger than the last. Each commitment changes the person's self-perception slightly. They are now someone who has done this thing, agreed to this position, complied with this request. The next request arrives not as an imposition, but as an opportunity to be consistent with who they have already become. The identity updates with each rung climbed. By the time the requests are large, the person has a self-concept that makes saying no feel like a betrayal of themselves. The compliance ladder explains phenomena that seem like mysteries of manipulation. How ordinary people end up in destructive cults. How employees end up complicit in institutional wrongdoing. How domestic abuse escalates through a pattern that victims describe as impossible to identify from inside. Each step seemed like a small thing. The accumulated staircase is visible only from outside or in retrospect. The research-confirmed counter is explicit self-monitoring of compliance history, not evaluating each new request against the previous one, but against a baseline of what you would have agreed to before the sequence began. The question isn't, Is this request bigger than the last? Is this request something I would have agreed to before all of this started? The ladder is long. The gap between the bottom rung and the top is not visible from the bottom. Most people don't realize they've climbed until they look down.